teaching at Southern is preaching and Adventist studies in Ellen White. I started mainly with preaching. My training is in the area of homiletics, theory, and preaching. But about 10 years ago, I still do preaching, but I transitioned to the Ellen White issues and Adventist history. That happened because students were bringing to me material they had seen against Ellen White. Let me test. Are we going to get feedback? Yeah. See, I'm going to be back and forth on the screen. And the weight of the audience is on this side, so I'll probably go to that screen, but we'll have to figure out how to navigate with this speaker here. But I was given this material, and it was against Ellen White, books against Ellen White, and they referred to be material that was on the internet. And so I began to research this, and it became a passion for me because Ellen White meant so much to me as a new convert. I was not raised in the church. I was converted to Adventism through a Kenneth Cox prophecy crusade. Ever heard of Kenneth Cox? Was baptized in the March of 1976 when I was 17 years old. And in those early months of my Adventist experience, I read Ellen White. She impacted me profoundly. And then I went to Southern as a student. And I remember instead of reading my textbooks, I would read Ellen White. And she was such a blessing to me. And so during the formative years of my life, she spoke so powerfully and profoundly to my personal life. And then years later, as a professor, I hear, got to watch those speakers, I hear all these negative things about her, and I couldn't let it go. So I began to research that, and it escalated into speaking appointments and culminated in a book, Ellen White Under Fire, which you'll see at the bookstore. So for the last 10 years, that's been my focus on Ellen White apologetics. That's defending the faith, defending the prophetic ministry of Ellen White. My most recent book, which I'll say more about later in the week, some today and tomorrow, dealing with Ellen White and the Civil War, is more advocating Ellen White's profound contribution to American history, to the Civil War. So I'm stepping a little bit beyond just defending her against the critics, although I still will do that. I am very interested in her impact on American history. And yes?
Probably wouldn't have the feedback problem just for standing in front of the speaker. If you're on the platform, probably you can wander back and forth.
And if it continues, I probably will slip up there. But I want to be able to move over to the screen. Actually, you know what? Let's try something. I was just thinking of my own comfort zone because I'm all at work. All right, thank you for that suggestion. And so that's been the direction that the Lord's taken my academic focus at Southern Adventist University. So that's why I'm here to talk to you about Ellen White. She's been such a blessing in my life. Let me give you an overview of the ground we're going to cover this week. Understanding Ellen White. Over the years, as I've spoken at camp meetings and dealt with generations of students on this subject, I felt a great sense of need among our people to really have a better understanding of who Ellen White is and what she was like as a person and the nature of her prophetic gift. This week is more of an overview, touching on some key subjects. This afternoon, we will talk about understanding Ellen White as a person. What was she like as a human being? We often focus on her prophetic gift, but what about her humanity? What was she really like as a person? Will the real Ellen White please stand? That's the focus this afternoon. Tomorrow, then we'll focus on the divine side, understanding her as a prophet. What was the nature of her prophetic gift? What are our scriptural foundations for the prophetic gift? And what is the relationship of her prophetic gift to the Bible? We'll talk about the divine side tomorrow. Then on Wednesday, understanding her as a writer. Ellen White wrote in a historical and literary context, and she meant for her writings to be understood in that context. So we'll look at principles of interpretation, how to understand Ellen White as a writer. That is the middle of the week. It kind of reaches an apex, because that's what it's all about, is reading Ellen White. So we'll look at principles of interpretation. Then On Thursday, understanding Ellen White as a theologian, and I don't mean as a formal theologian. She wasn't a formal theologian in the sense of those of us who teach theology and categorize it into an organized format. She was more a pop theologian, a practical theologian. Nevertheless, there are themes that come together in her writings. And I want to talk about those themes on Thursday and their implication for our daily lives. And finally, we'll end with understanding Ellen White on Friday as a mentor. And I specifically have in mind how she mentored the church through the Civil War era. That's, of course, is what my present book is about, and I will talk to you in some detail about that. I've just been immersed in the Civil War the last 4 years writing this book. It took me 4 years to write the book as long as it took to fight the Civil War. And I have resisted not talking about the Civil War all week long, because as I understood my assignment to do the general coverage of Ellen White, but I will probably slip some things in about the Civil War as the week progresses. But that's the roadmap for our adventure together at this time, each day this week. So let's begin with today's presentation. Will the real Ellen White please stand? What was she like? There are many negative caricatures of Ellen White, unfortunately. You find these on the internet. I pulled these from the internet some years ago. This is Saint Ellen. And you find this on some of the negative anti-Ellen White websites. They are legion, those websites, and making fun of her vision of holding the Bible. And this one's even more negative in its caricature, putting her face on the Pope, Pope Ellen. The irony of it is, while this is most unfair and somewhat cruel, yet there may be some Adventist circles where she might be viewed this way. So this is meant to poke fun at her and us, yet there may be some truth to it in some circles. And these are a number of negative books using Ellen White's name, taking her name in vain, if you will. White Lie is a classic, and the Whitewash, Whiteout. I've dealt with these. I've written about them in my book, Ellen White Under Fire, and other publications, and spoken about these. That's not my focus this week. If you have questions about critics and criticisms, I'm glad to address that. But my focus is elsewhere. But this is a caricature you find of Ellen White. This is not the real Ellen White. In our more conservative circles, the supportive circles of Ellen White, you often find this, Sister White says, like a hammer, like a rod slapping someone over the head. Sister White said this, brother. Sister White said that, sister. So you better do it or you're going to be lost. Put that ice cream away, because Sister White said sugar clogs the system. By the way, Ellen White had a favorite dessert. Breathe deeply. You'll get by it. You'll get by it. I'll tell you about that dessert later. But Sister White says that's not a helpful view of Ellen White. Yes, we quote her. She has some great things to say, but not in this posture. That's the idea. She really is a forgotten figure of history, although just recently, in the last decade, historians outside of the Adventist community have developed an interest in Ellen White as a figure of American religious history. And she's made a contribution. In fact, that's what I've endeavored to do in my recent book on the Civil War is place her in that historical context. And more historians are recognizing that Ellen White had a voice that went even beyond the Adventist church. But in general, she's been a forgotten figure of history. Will the real Ellen White please stand? What was she like as a person? She was a visionary, church leader, public speaker, prolific author. But we tend to forget that she was also a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a friend. She was a human being. She had extraordinary experiences. She had the prophetic gift, the gift of inspiration. Her inaugural vision, she saw the people of God, the Millerites, walking on a long and narrow path. That vision is most significant. We will say more about it later. But the personality of Ellen White, the humanity of Ellen White, we have neglected that. We have tended to focus only on the divine side. And you know what that has caused? A lopsided view of Ellen White. She's often perceived as what Roger Kuhn used to say, a vegetarian Virgin Mary. She was not a vegetarian Virgin Mary. She did not float 3 feet off the ground. And to put it in more contemporary terms, she was not Wonder Woman. She was a real human being who got sick, who got mad, who got glad, who got sad. She was human just like you and me. She had both feet on the ground as she walked those dusty, dirty streets of 19th century cities. So we need to focus on the human side, the person of Ellen White, the personality, her human experience. So what was she like? More and more has been written about this. And so I want to pull from that. And let's look first of all at her family background. What was she like? What was her family like? Well, her parents were of British ancestry, sturdy New England stock. Her father, Robert F. Harmon, he was a farmer originally when they lived in Gorham, Maine, where Ellen was born. And these are places I take my students on a tour. We go on an Adventist heritage tour each fall, and we visit in New England these places. We go to Gorham, Maine. We go to the birthplace. The house doesn't stand anymore, but we've located the exact place where she was born. He was a farmer there, but then he became a hat maker, and they moved to Portland, Maine, where Ellen grew up. Lots of great Adventist history in Portland, Maine. Her mother, Eunice Gould Harmon, that's where we get the Ellen G. White. Of course, she became White when she married James White, as you know. So we get the G from Gould in her mother's name, Eunice Gould Harmon, a housewife, homemaker. Ellen's mother was profoundly impactful on her experience, her early spiritual experience. In fact, her mother was God used her mother as an agent in her conversion experience. They were members of the Portland, Maine Chestnut St. Methodist Church, which still stands. It's a restaurant now, but it still has the appearance of a church. Robert was a deacon. Based on our research into the records of the church, while it was still a church, it was found that of the Millerites that were disfellowshipped, the first family disfellowshipped was the Harmon family. They, of course, became Millerites, embraced the preaching of William Miller, but that last year the Millerites were persecuted because they preached a message that was quite contrary to the popular teaching of the day. The popular teaching of the day was that Christ will come after the millennium. And so Americans were very optimistic. The clergy were very optimistic. People were preparing themselves. They were perfecting the nation for the millennium, to usher in the great millennium. Then Christ would come afterward. So there was no sense of urgency of God breaking through in the second coming. But William Miller said, Jesus is coming soon. And so that last year, as the Millerite momentum really picked up and they set a specific date, they were rejected in their churches. And that's what happened with the Harmon family. The entire family was ousted from the church. Ellen and her sisters, who I'll say more about in a moment, it was a very difficult experience for them. Especially one of Ellen White's sisters took it so hard she rejected Christianity. This was in September of 1843. She had 5 sisters, including a twin, and 2 brothers. Let's look at each one here briefly. Her oldest sister, Caroline Harmon, married into the Clow family. She was the wife of a Methodist clergyman. She married a Methodist clergyman. Now, let me tell you that in the early years of Ellen White's visions, she would travel from place to place and share her visions. And her sisters traveled with her. They were supportive of her. They listened to her visions. But as things moved on and the Sabbatarian Adventist organized into the Seventh-day Adventist, many of her sisters didn't become Seventh-day Adventist. Caroline, one of them. Here's a picture of Caroline, her older sister. Here's a picture of Ellen at 44, Caroline at age 60. What I find most interesting in the relationship of Ellen White with her sisters who married into other faiths and never embraced her Seventh-day Adventist faith is that she respected her sister's Christianity. They were not Seventh-day Adventist. But you find her saying things like, we have disagreements, but our hearts are one. In fact, a letter wrote about Caroline. She said, Caroline, your gift is singing. That's not my gift. My gift is speaking. And that was true. Ellen didn't sing, but she could preach. She could speak. She was kind of like me. She made a noise and tended to be joyful. That's why you'll never hear special music from me. I only sing when it can be drowned out by others. I guess it was that way with Ellen. But she respected their Christianity. Never once in the letters is there a condemnation of their faith. I find that a great lesson for us as Adventists.
Amen.
In how we relate to people of other faiths. We have differences, but we can be their friend. We can find mutual agreement on the inspiration of the Bible, the love of Jesus, Jesus as Savior, the second coming. We may have different views of the second coming, but we need to connect with our Baptist and our Methodist friends. I said this one time in a camp meeting some years ago, and a person came up to me and said, well, Ellen White was confused and didn't understand because, see, these other churches are Babylon, and we shouldn't connect with them. We should stay far away from them. Well, first of all, that's a misunderstanding of the Babylon concept, which kicks in at the end of time, but that was not how Ellen White operated. In fact, years later, she encouraged Adventists to connect with the Women's Christian Temperance organization, to work with them when we can. So Ellen White respected the Christian experience of people outside of the Seventh-day Adventist faith. If she can do that, I can too. That's a great lesson for us. That doesn't mean you compromise your faith. In fact, I tell my students, what's the best way to witness to someone? Take a Sunday law tract and place it in their hands, shove it in their face? No. There may be a time for that, but not initially. You develop a relationship, a friendship. That may mean if you want them to come to church with you on Saturday, maybe you should go to church with them on Sunday. That's a friendship. That's a relationship. That's how Ellen White engaged with her sisters of other faiths. So many lessons from her personal life. Another sister, Harriet Harmon, also married a Methodist clergyman. And John B. Harmon, one of her brothers, was a businessman in Illinois as he grew up. He did not become an Adventist either. Mary Plummer Harmon Foss married into the interesting Foss family, married Hazen Foss' brother. Very interesting story behind that, which I won't take time to tell this afternoon. She did accept the Seventh-day Adventist beliefs, but never became a baptized member. Sarah Harmon Belden married Stephen Belden, became a Seventh-day Adventist. So one of her sisters did become a Seventh-day Adventist. In fact, their son would write some hymns and made a significant contribution in that area to the Adventist church years later. Robert Harmon Jr., the only brother of Ellen White to become a Seventh-day Adventist. Unfortunately, he died of consumption at age 27. Ellen and her brother were really close, and his death was very difficult for her. My mother is 87, about to turn 88, and she still will tell me the story of when her little brother died when they were children. How she's never forgotten that to this very day, how hard it was for her. The grief that she went through. She remembers it, she's told me just recently, as if it were yesterday. That's how Ellen felt about the loss of Robert. They were very close, and she writes about how grieved she was, even years later, at his loss. Elizabeth, or who Ellen referred to as Lizzie, was her fraternal twin, the only twin. Lizzie married Reuben Bangs, a Portland, Maine grocer. Now, according to Arthur White, the grandson of Ellen White, son of W.C. White, Lizzie never accepted Ellen's gift. She never became a Seventh-day Adventist, and she never even became a Christian. In fact, Ellen they remembered her saying that she did not expect to see Lizzie in heaven. Now, was that because Lizzie never became a vegetarian or accepted the three angels' message or started keeping the Sabbath? No, because Lizzie rejected Christianity altogether. She was really hurt. She took the Millerite ousting, the disfellowshipping from the church very hard. They lost their friends, and Lizzie evidently never recovered from it. And so as far as Ellen could tell, Lizzie never accepted Christ. That's what she meant when she said she did not expect to see Lizzie in heaven, because Lizzie did not accept Jesus. But on Lizzie's deathbed, Ellen made an appeal to Lizzie. And I'll tell you about that a little later. Got to hold some suspense. I know the afternoon nap's over, but, you never know when that might hit. So keep a little suspense. Here's a picture of Ellen and Lizzie here. Elizabeth Bangs. Ellen standing, Lizzie sitting. You can see some similarity. The facial features are a bit different due to Ellen's accident we're about to talk about. At age 9, Ellen Harmon suffered a tragic accident. Grown up in the Adventist church, you've of course heard this story before about Ellen's accident, which she later wrote was to affect my whole life. She was struck on the nose by a stone, hurled by a classmate angry at a childish trifle. They were walking home from school, and the children, or Ellen and her friend, sister, we believe, they were on their way home. They had an argument with this girl. She was following them. They were trying to get away from her. And they took a shortcut across a commons, which was a little park. And we used to say this was the big park, Central Park in Maine, but we found another place. It's now a parking lot. I take my students by there on the tour. It's a series of apartments, but you can still see it was just a small little park. And they were cutting across that to get home as fast as they could. The girl, seeing them, walking rapidly, evidently threw a stone, probably not meaning to hit them, but perhaps to scare them. We don't know for sure. But Ellen just happened to turn to see where the girl was, and the girl's aim was not what she thought, and it struck her right on the nose. Knocked her out cold. She woke up. She remembers vaguely a little bit in a grocery store that blood was everywhere, was streaming from her face. Today, you would stabilize her. Medics would stabilize her, carry her to a hospital on a stretcher. They picked her up, and the girl who threw the stone and her sister, they walked her back home, which intensified the trauma, and she went into a coma for several weeks after that. She was in a coma 3 weeks, continued to lay in a great cradle. This is what she was told. A cradle was made for her, and it was constructed especially for her. She said she laid there many additional weeks. Her father even came home during this period. He was away when the accident happened, and he did not even recognize his daughter. She had a little bit of consciousness, and she remembers him looking over and not even recognizing her. Her face was so disfigured and swollen from the accident. I was reduced almost to a skeleton. Her personal physician and family did not expect her to survive. Convinced that she was dying, the young 9-year-old Ellen gave her heart to Jesus in simple faith. Now, one Ellen White scholar, Merlin Bird at the seminary, has written an extensive study, an excellent study, on Ellen White's conversion experience. And there are 3 phases to her conversion. You won't be able to go into that into detail now, but this was her first phase, her initial conversion. She accepted Jesus. She believed on her deathbed. Several months later, on January 25, 1837, a dramatic aurora borealis lit up the New England sky. It's a phenomenon. Up in the north, the skies become brilliant. I looked this up and read newspaper reports. This was a particularly brilliant display in the sky of colors. And many people thought it was the end of the world. And Ellen remembers, as a child, screams and shoutings from the neighbors. They thought the end of everything was at hand. But Ellen thought, it's the second coming of Jesus. And her mother came in the room and picked her up and brought her to the window, and she clapped her hands. She was excited. Jesus was coming back. All her pain would go away now. Her sufferings would be gone. Jesus is coming. But the night went on and the lights faded. But I was disappointed, she later recalled. The singular appearance faded away from the heavens, and the next morning, the sun arose the same as usual. And that plunged young Ellen into great depression. The prospect that she must continue living in the midst of her suffering extinguished her short-lived childlike joy. Over the next 4 years, she struggled with discouragement and chronic depression. Because of her poor health, she could not return to school and gave up her hope of an education, something she very much desired. Oh, Ellen was good at school. In fact, years later, she was riding on a train, and a woman behind her tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, is your name Ellen?" She said, "Yes, it is." She said, "I remember you when we were in school together in Portland, Maine. You were so smart. Whenever the teacher wanted somebody to read the lesson, she always picked you." Ellen wrote about that experience, this former classmate that she remembered, and that just gives you a glimpse into the type of student Ellen was. She was articulate. She was a good reader. She was intelligent, but now all that was gone. She loved school. She couldn't go back to school because of the accident. "I was unreconciled to my lot," she wrote, "and at times murmured against the providence of God in thus afflicting me." And what did that do? That produced guilt. Her conscience was unusually sensitive. You see this throughout her life. Very sensitive soul. And she experienced strong feelings of guilt over her resentment. Her simple faith in Jesus disappeared, and she was left in darkness. So her initial conversion disappeared quite quickly. Just checking the time here. We can go till the evening meeting, right? Till about 7. This feeling was compounded by her belief in an eternally burning hell. Of course, she was brought up in the United Episcopal Methodist Church, and they taught eternal burning hell, and that's what she learned as a child. This exacerbated her fear and agony of soul. Here's what she wrote years later, reflecting on this period in her life in relationship to the doctrine of hell, eternal hell as she understood it. "In my mind, the justice of God eclipsed His mercy and love. The mental anguish I passed through at this time was very great. I had been taught to believe in an eternally burning hell. And as I thought of the wretched state of the sinner without God, without hope, I was in deep despair. I feared that I should be lost and that I should live throughout eternity a living death. The horrifying thought was ever before me that my sins were too great to be forgiven and that I should be forever lost. When the thought took possession of my mind that God delighted in the torture of His creatures who were formed in His image, a wall of darkness seemed to separate me from Him. When I reflected that the Creator of the universe would plunge the wicked into hell, there to burn through the ceaseless rounds of eternity, my heart sank with fear. And I despaired that so cruel and tyrannical a being, as she perceived Him, would ever condescend to save me from the doom of sin. I thought that the fate of the condemned sinner would be mine, to endure the flames of hell forever, even as long as God Himself existed. Almost total darkness settled upon me, and there seemed no way out of the shadows. Psychologists would probably label this as clinical depression. And that's probably what she experienced for several years as a young woman. She also read devotional books, this is as a young girl, from the church library that described little girls as living saintly lives free from doubt, sins, and weaknesses. There was a tendency of 19th century literature to present children as saintly little beings. Perfect, which we know is so far from the truth. Bless their little hearts. But young Ellen, in her childlike mind, thought, this is reality. So if they're like that, she should be like that. And she realized she was not saintly. She had discouragement and doubt and frustrations. So this plunged her deeper into chronic depression. Fortunately, this happened for several years. Fortunately, though, a breakthrough in her spiritual experience occurred at the Buxton, Maine Methodist camp meeting late in the summer of 1841. Now, these early Methodist camp meetings, they are quite different from our camp meeting today. These were the shouting Methodists. raised their hands and they shouted and they sang and they had quite a charismatic experience, okay? It would be quite different than what we're used to. But that was a part of the experience. And God used this in Ellen's conversion. Upon hearing a convicting sermon on righteousness by faith, Ellen cried out to God for salvation. It's interesting as you read about the conversion of great spiritual leaders in history. It seems that they were sitting in church listening to a sermon that changed their lives. That's what happened to Ellen White right here. Ellen Harmon at the time. She described that experience. As I knelt, they had the altar call, and the prayer bench, and everyone came up. And so she writes, as I knelt and prayed, suddenly my burden left me, and my heart was light. I can never forget this precious assurance. I bolded that phrase. This precious assurance of the pitying tenderness of Jesus towards one so unworthy of his notice. This is the second phase of her conversion, which lasted to the day she died. Note the word precious assurance. Ellen Harmon, at this experience in her life, received precious assurance. Assurance that Jesus accepted her as she was. That Jesus loved her. That Jesus would save her just as she was. Now that theme would continue for the rest of her life. Now in my book, Ellen White Under Fire, there are 5 pages. And I start with this quote. 5 pages of one quote after another with brief explanation on Ellen White's view of assurance of salvation. It started here. It goes all the way to the end of her life. She spoke repeatedly of the preciousness of assurance, acceptance in the Savior's arms. That meant everything to her. She has some strong things to say about obedience, strong rebukes for those who disobey, but the gospel of salvation and assurance is never far off in her writings. And it finds its root right here in this second phase of her conversion. And the depression lifted. The culmination of Ellen's conversion experience was a counseling session in 1843 initiated by her mother with an Adventist Methodist minister named Levi Stockman. He was a Millerite minister, respected. Ellen had several dreams, not necessarily prophetic dreams, but significant dreams that clearly the Lord was leading. I'll tell you about one of those dreams on Thursday. This is before she actually received the prophetic mantle. But she had heard about Stockman, and her mother encouraged her to go talk with Stockman. Now, Stockman was dying of tuberculosis. They called that, in that day, consumption. He was being consumed by this disease, and Ellen herself had it. She would, of course, be healed from it. They didn't have antibiotics in those days, and if you had this consumption, you were what the 19th century called marked for the grave. You were soon to die. This meeting with Stockman transformed her outlook. She shared her experience with Stockman. As he listened, he felt impressed to tell her that, Ellen, God has something special in store for you. Everything that you've related to me, all of your trials, all of your experiences, the dreams that I believe God has given you, He's planning you, or He is preparing something special for you. He's got a great work for you. Now, how do you think she felt upon hearing that? Encouraged. Interestingly, they both had this lung disease, so they coughed their way through this interview. Stockman would eventually die, but Ellen survived, of course. This meeting was set up by her mother. I told you her mother was such an influential person in her spiritual experience. And after this meeting, she jumped ahead there. She went to another Methodist camp meeting, and then she had what Methodists call this blessing of sanctification. And that completed her conversion experience. She had received precious assurance of salvation, but with that comes discipleship, obedience, sanctification. The theological terms we used are justification, sanctification together. That was the final phase of her conversion experience, and it would play a significant role in later life. would influence Ellen White's theological thought the rest of her life. I'll say more about that on Thursday when I talk about her as a theologian and the influence of Methodist theology in her background. God was leading the Methodists. He was leading John Wesley. Interesting connection. And by the way, Wesley, if you can read carefully, you can see that Ellen mentored from Wesley. And the way she dealt with issues is very similar to how Wesley did. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead to Thursday, but that's a very interesting feature. So then, after attending several of the Millerite meetings, and that increased her spiritual experience, hearing William Miller preach, then the great day of disappointment came. The Millerites were disappointed. Jesus didn't come. And then you have the aftermath. In December of 1844, a couple of months after the disappointment, Ellen received her first formal prophetic vision, which began 70 years of prophetic ministry. She saw the Millerites walking on this long and narrow path. Behind them was a bright light. She was told that's the midnight cry. That is the message of the second coming of Christ. The Millerite message was clearly a message ordained by God. The light ahead of them was the blessed hope, the promise of the second coming. But she also, you'll notice in the picture, and this is what she saw as she describes the vision, she saw the person of Jesus. And she said, we were all safe on the path as long as we kept our eyes on Jesus. Those who took their eyes off Jesus, well, you know what happened. They stumbled and fell off the path into the dark and wicked world below. This tells us a lot about Ellen White's prophetic ministry, themes that would occupy her thought for the next 70 years. The message of the judgment, the commencement of the final judgment, and the prophetic role of Seventh-day Adventists in history, that's a dominant theme. And of course, the second coming, that permeates all of her writings. And also, the vital truth that Christianity at its core is a relationship with Jesus, with the person of Jesus. And that true Christianity is being friends with Jesus. That's keeping your eyes on Jesus. These themes permeated Ellen White's writings. The rest of her life, they began at this inaugural vision. Here's Ellen White in her early 30s. This is in the late 1850s. I'll show you some pictures as we go along. And here is the earliest picture we have of Ellen and James. It's a bit corrupted, as you can see. She married James White in Portland, Maine on August 30, 1846. As I point out in my book on the Civil War, they were both Yankees. And they married in Yankee, Maine and raised their children in Yankee, Michigan. At this time, he was 25 years old and she was 18. James had been traveling with Ellen as she shared her visions. That was somewhat scandalous, a man traveling with a group of women, Ellen and her sisters. But during that time, they caught each other's eye, and they developed a friendship, which turned into a relationship. At first, they thought they shouldn't get married because Jesus was coming soon, but then they realized they could support one another in the ministry better. James could be a support to her with her visions, and so they got married. It was convenient for their work, but they also loved each other. That began a great adventure until James died in 1881. Tell you a bit about their marriage. This is the personal side. Now, they had a good marriage overall, but it had its ups and downs like every marriage. There were times when James, he overworked. You know what Ellen told him one time? She said they had a house in the Colorado Rockies. And she told James, now, James, go out there with Willie, his son, and fish and hunt and enjoy yourself. Relax. Be a boy again. That's what she told him. Now, in the younger generation's language, really what she was saying, because he was such an intense worker, James, dude, chill out. That's what she was saying, okay? I know that the younger generation would say it that way. James, relax, have a good time. And he did that, and it helped him. And when he had his strokes, Ellen took him to health institutes and nursed him back to health. Although the strokes, as he had several in later life, they reconfigured his personality a bit. He became really cantankerous and somewhat paranoid and very negative, and that caused problems in the marriage. He became critical of Ellen, and she felt she needed to get away from him. Now, what happened is something interesting I want to tell you. In the 1970s, about 1976, a series of letters were given to the White Estate, a host of letters, hundreds of letters by various workers, and there were a number of letters written by Ellen White that the White Estate was not aware of. They, of course, authenticated that this was the actual writing of Ellen White, and it's Ellen White writing in the 1870s, mid-1870s. She's writing to her best friend, Lucinda, and she is confiding in Lucinda about her struggles with James in their marriage. These were real people who had struggles. I want to share with you some of this. I'm pulling from this book that you can get at the ABC by my friend George Knight. He has encapsulated the best statements here. But this will give you a sense of how real these people were. So she writes to Lucinda. Now the background is James was in the East attending camp meetings, and Ellen was in California writing. And James was telling to Ellen, look, you need to come back to the East and go on a camp meeting tour with me right now. She didn't really want to do that. Here's what she wrote. I've not lost my love for my husband, she wrote to Lucinda, but I cannot explain things. I cannot but dread the liability of James' changeable moods. His strong feelings, his censures, his viewing me in the light he does. Should I come east, James' happiness might suddenly change to complaining and fretting. Is this familiar to anybody? I am thoroughly disgusted with the state of things and do not mean to place myself where there is the least liability of its occurring. I must work as God should direct. God in His providence is giving us each our work, and we will do it separately, independently. He is happy, I am happy, but the happiness might all be changed should we meet. Here's a bit of discouragement coming out. A great share of my life's youthfulness has been lost. I cannot have confidence in James' judgment in reference to my duty. He seems to want to dictate to me as though I were a child. So they were having some struggles. It appears they were separate for a little while and happy with that situation. 2 days later, she wrote to Lucinda again. I dare not go east without an assurance that God would have me go. I'm perfectly willing to go if the light shines that way, but the Lord knows what is best for me, for James, and for the cause of God. My husband is happy. Blessed news. If my presence is detrimental to his happiness, God forbid that I should be connected with him. I will do my work as God leads me. He may do his work as God leads him. We will not get in each other's way. I do not think my husband really desires my society. He charges a good share of his unhappiness upon me. I think, she said to Lucinda, he would be satisfied if he had the entire control of me, soul and body. But this he cannot have. I sometimes think he is not really a sane man. But I don't know. May God teach and lead and guide. James wrote this in one of his letters. I shall use the good old head God, and there was a conversation before this, but let's just pick it up here. I shall use the good old head God gave me until he reveals that I am wrong. Your head won't fit my shoulders. Keep it where it belongs. And I will try to honor God and use in my own. I shall be glad to hear from you, but don't waste your precious time and strength lecturing me on matters of mere opinions. Ellen and James White. Yeah, I think that was a real marriage. Well, Ellen felt convicted. Several days later, she wrote a letter to James, apologizing for her attitude. And not too long after that, she was on her way back east to be with James. Then she wrote to Lucinda, and she apologized to Lucinda for confiding in Lucinda with her struggles. Here's what she said. I am sorry I wrote you the letters I have. Whatever may have been my feelings, I need not have troubled you with them. Burn all my letters, and I will relate no matters that perplex me to you. The sin bearer is my refuge. He has invited me to come to him for rest when weary and heavy laden. I will not be guilty of uttering a word again, whatever it may be the circumstance. And as far as we know, she did that. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, didn't she ask Lucinda to burn the letters? Lucinda didn't burn the letters, but why are you reading these letters publicly now? That's a good question. Let me answer it. The White estate, of course, when they received these letters, upon Ellen White's death in her will, one of the stipulations was the White estate would be the manager of all of her writings, which gave them complete discretion on how to use them, when to release them, how to use them for the good of the church. And they have felt that these letters to Lucinda about the struggle she had with James would be very helpful to Adventist people. Understanding that even James and Ellen struggled in their marriage, but in the end, they stayed together. And they still loved each other. And when James died, they were greatly in love, and Ellen grieved his loss profoundly. So that's why I share these letters with you. It's a part of the human side, the human situation, the reality of our pioneers. I tell you, the more I study the humanity of Ellen White, the greater is my respect for her prophetic gift. We need to see both sides. She was a real human being, but had an extraordinary gift. Sometimes, in some circles of Adventism, she's exalted greater than the biblical prophets. They sinned, but she didn't. But as we know, David, that boy had some issues. But what a great man of God. Same with Ellen White. She had 4 sons. 2 died, 2 lived into adulthood. It's typical, and this was actually a small family in the 19th century. They had large families because it was typical for young children to die. John Herbert, their youngest son, died on the eve of the Civil War. I tell more about this story in the book. At age 2.5 months with a terrible disease that inflicted the skin, it was very difficult for the family. James himself had to conduct the funeral. Imagine that, having to conduct the funeral for your own son. I could not imagine that. Ellen White wrote about this experience as the little baby was suffering. My dear babe was a great sufferer. 24 months and nights we anxiously watched over him. At times I could not control my feelings as I witnessed his sufferings. As I listened to his labored breathing and felt his pulseless wrist, I knew that he must die. We watched his feeble, grasping breath until it ceased. My heart ached as though it would break. That's pain. That's genuine, authentic pain and grief. But that wasn't all. Henry died at age 16. This is several years into the war. In fact, in December of 1863, when all Northerners were celebrating Grant's victories at Chattanooga, my hometown, which I write a lot about in the book. As they were celebrating the great victories, the whites were stricken with grief. Henry was dying of pneumonia, and on December 8th, he gave in and died. Ellen White later wrote, both the youngest and oldest branches of the family have been broken off. So, it was a very difficult experience. Henry was a very gifted young man. Ellen White wrote of Henry, when our sweet singer, he was gifted musically, unlike his mother. When our sweet singer was borne to the grave and we no more heard his early song, ours was a lonely home. So Ellen White experienced a lot of pain, a lot of grief. Here's the family with the surviving children, Willie and Edson. This picture is after the war years in 1865. Let's talk about the children. Edson, oh Edson. Edson was the bad boy. There's a picture of Edson as a teenager and then the adult. Edson gave his mother heartache and gray hairs. He was the child who didn't do anything that she wanted. In fact, in 1854, when he was a baby, she wrote, "You have seen Henry." Henry, of course, the older. Edson, the next oldest. Well, Edson, this is when Edson was 5 years old, has more life and roughery than Henry, so you must know my hands are full. Well, it would be that way into his teen years. And when he got into those teen years, my. And that was around 1865. In fact, he and his brother Henry, they wanted to join the army. And Henry wanted to be a drummer in the war. And they made bow and arrows and shot birds as if they were in battle. And got all the local Adventists upset at the whites because the warlike play of the white boys. So in 1865, she wrote to Edson regarding his disposition to disobedience. He was 16 years old at the time. She said, "You not only disobeyed us yourself, but led Willie." Willie was 5 years younger. Willie to disobedience. Let me put the picture so you can see them. Yeah, little Willie, see there? "A thorn has been planted in my heart from that time when I became convinced that you could not be trusted. A gloom which I cannot express shrouds our minds in regard to your influence upon Willie. This influence we have seen has affected our noble-hearted, truthful Willie. You do things and enjoin upon him strict secrecy, and when questioned he evades it by saying, 'I don't know.'" And I tell my students the term that they use today that my kids used when they were growing up, it's not "I don't know," it's "whatever." Whatever. Oh, that whatever. The belt would come off after that. I was tired of that. Whatever. Give him a nice lecture. Whatever. Whatever. He gave him the I don't know. I don't know. That's like whatever. When he does know, and thus you lead him to lie in order to keep concealed your cherished darling projects. "Oh, Edson," now listen to the cry of her heart. "Oh, Edson, it is the knowledge of these things that is wearing me out and bringing upon me discouragement, which will compel me to cease laboring in the cause of God." She had a wayward child. In fact, Edson, one time, took a whole month's salary and bought an expensive coat and a watch with a chain link on it and paraded up and down in front of the Review and Herald. His mother said not to read the popular fiction of the day. He read it all. She even describes him sitting in church, propping his feet up on the pew, laying back and napping through the sermon. Sitting next to her, his prophet mother. So this was pretty discouraging. But then she said this. She said, "You seemed as much pleased in the society of Marcus Ashley," that's Edson's bad boy friend, "as with your own innocent brother Willie." Speaking of Willie, she said, "He is a treasure, beloved of God, but I fear your influence will ruin him." My poor Willie. You see what's going on there? Was that a good thing to do? No. She was not a perfect parent. She was a human parent. All of her great things about parenting, counsels to parents, that would come years later. Okay? After experience of doing right and wrong things and visions. Okay? "My poor Willie," she cried out. "I see no way for us but to cease traveling and do what we can to save our own children." So they struggled with Edson. As Edson grew older, he married a girl that they did not approve of, and Ellen wrote to Edson in her repeated epistles, "Your father weeps over your case." Well, finally, when he was 43 years old, Edson decided he was going to give up all the faith. And he wrote to his brother Willie. And by the way, his relationship with Willie was strained because of that contrasting of good little Willie and bad Edson. That affected their relationship, see? And he told Willie first, I'm out of here. I'm giving up all of this. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And Willie shared that with his mother, and she'd written many epistles to Edson over the years. And of course, this grieved her, and she wrote one more epistle that came from the heart of a mother and expressed her yearning for her son's salvation in the only way a mother can. This particular letter, she did not put in the hands of a secretary to type up. This she wrote out with her own hand, and Edson read it that way. And it began, interestingly, this way. Edson, please read this carefully. Do not cast it aside or burn it. Evidently, he had burned some of her previous letters. And so he read it. And it was moved. It was about a dream she had about him. I won't go into detail, but it impacted him profoundly. She appealed to him to come to Christ. And this was the turning point for Edson. That was his conversion experience. He gave his heart to the Lord. And his next question was, what can I do for God's cause? Well, sometime later, it was Edson who realized the Civil War years had passed, the Reconstruction had passed, and we Adventists had not done anything for the black people in the South. And Edson went down south and pioneered the work among the blacks in this country. He still had his struggles. In fact, he was never a good manager of money, and some of his mother's estate, when she died, went off to pay Edson's debts. That's Edson. Willie. Now, Willie was different. Ellen and Willie really got along. They were like two peas in a pod. Their personalities were similar. And when James died, James was the editor of Ellen's works and helped her get her grammar right and so forth, helped her in her writings. When he died, she had a dream. The Lord gave her a dream, and the Lord said, Willie will be your helper. W.C. White. And he did that for the rest of his life. He's the first one who directed the White estate. He was the manager of her editorial staff in the remaining years of her life when the great books we know, such as Desire of Ages, Steps to Christ, were put together. So he played a great role, but his little Willie, he was a normal boy. You see the younger and the older Willie there. And little Willie didn't like the teacher at his school, the Battle Creek area. Didn't like his teacher. And one day, he snuck into an open window and scribbled a poem he'd written about his teacher whom he did not like. The next morning, all the children filed in and the teacher, and this is what they read on the chalkboard. The devil flew east, west, north, and south, and picked Miss Jones up in his mouth. But when he saw he had a fool, he dropped her here to teach the school. Willie White, son of the prophet. The teacher looked at the students and said, okay, which one of you wrote that? She actually knew Willie wrote it because she recognized his handwriting. Who wrote that? Come on, she waited. Did you write it? Who wrote that? Nobody fessed up. She walked right up to Willie. Mr. White, I know that you wrote that because I recognize your handwriting. Now I want you to take it back. By that she meant you should apologize. Well, according to the story that's told by Arthur White, we really don't know exactly what happened, whether he apologized or not, but according to Arthur White, he said probably based on his knowledge of Willie's father, James White, they took a trip that evening to the woodpile, which means he got a whipping. A story about the older Willie, as you see there. He was one of these people who could sleep anywhere, any place, anytime. Don't you envy those people? And one Sabbath, Ellen was preaching a powerful sermon, disclosing things she'd seen in vision to this congregation. It was solemn. Willie was sitting behind her. she's preaching, and she noticed some smiles on the audience's face. And they're looking over her shoulder. And she pauses for a moment, and then she hears this. She turned around, and there's the beard on the chest. He's gone. She turns back to the audience, and those smiles disappear. They think, oh no, what's the prophet going to do? She proceeded to tell them the story. She said, because she knew she couldn't continue with her message at that point. She said, when Willie was a little baby, and I would go and preach at the huge tabernacle in Battle Creek, a big pulpit, the brethren, because I had to have my baby with me, the brethren constructed a little cradle that fit in the pulpit. And so whenever I'd go and preach, I could put baby Willie there. And with my foot, I could rock him while I preached. He would sleep through my sermon. As you can see today, brothers and sisters, he's not gotten over the habit. And of course that loosened up the audience, and they got a kick out of that. When I was a youth pastor, before I came to Southern, one time I'd use humor with kids. You've got to survive, in the right way, of course. And I got a stack of quotes, Ellen White quotes, against using humor in the pulpit. And of course I read those and understood the context. In the 19th century, preachers of that day often started their sermons with just jokes unrelated to the sermon. And they overdid it. It distracted from the message. And Adventist preachers started doing that. That's the historical context for that council. She's not saying never use any humor that's appropriate. Ellen White was not against humor. In fact, I'm about to tell you some funny stories here in a minute. She enjoyed laughing, and she had no problem in the pulpit using the right humorous touch. In that case, it was because of an incident, but if it enhanced the message, if it loosens up the audience so they can receive the message, she was not against that at all. But telling mindless, aimless jokes just for a good laugh, that's what she was against, and that certainly is inappropriate. So that's Willie. Here she is in her late 30s. This is, in fact, a picture you'll find in my book. This is how she looked during the Civil War years. Here she is at 48 years old in 1875. This is a picture in 1878 when she was finishing the third volume of the Spirit of Prophecy series. That's the last series that was the forerunner to the Conflict of the Age series that we know of today. I'll say more about that on Thursday. Some about that tomorrow as well, or Wednesday. Here she is with her twin sister, Lizzie. I tell you what I've done. I have gotten carried away, which I often do, and I've said so much that I've cut my latter part short. I was thinking I got an hour and 15 minutes, and so I just slowed down and gave a lot of nuances and detail. But now, as it always happens with me, I cut myself short or I go too long, and so I won't be able to tell you the whole story about Lizzie, but I want to at least read to you her letter, parts of her letter to Lizzie on her deathbed. This is Ellen the evangelist. Lizzie was dying. Lizzie did not know Jesus. Did Ellen White tell her, Lizzie, if you'll just become a vegetarian and just keep one Sabbath, you'll go to heaven? No, of course not. Here's what she said. Don't you believe on Jesus, Lizzie? Don't you believe he is your Savior? All that is required of you, is to take Jesus as your own precious Savior. To everyone inquiring, what must I do to be saved? I answer, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. Do not doubt for a moment that he wants to save you just as you are. With Jesus as your blessed friend, you need not fear to die, for it will be to you like the closing of your eyes here and opening them in heaven. But as far as she could tell, Lizzie never accepted her invitation. That's why she would say in later life, I don't expect to see Lizzie in heaven, because Lizzie did not accept her invitation to embrace Jesus. And without Jesus, there is no salvation. And there's another beautiful story, that one I won't be able to tell because of time, about Lizzie's child, a beautiful story there. Lizzie and her husband had an infant that died, and Ellen gave him a most encouraging message. Here is Ellen in 1881, the year that James died. This this was a very difficult experience for her. She said James was the best man that ever trod shoe leather. And she loved him dearly in spite of the struggles they had had and how his strokes had changed him. And so she would carry on alone the rest of her life in God's work. Here she is at the Reno, Nevada campground in May 1880. Can you spot her there? My cursor is... Well, you can't see it there. Okay, there you go. Direct my cursor. Where is she at? Is she here? Here? Over here? That's Jan Loughborough. Ah, there you go. See her holding the Bible? You know the significance of 1888, don't you? That was the famous year of the Minneapolis meetings that fall in 1888, which changed the course of the denomination. It had been spiraling into legalism. Ellen White had been telling them repeatedly that they need to emphasize righteousness by faith in the gospel. But the leadership was taking a different direction. It was the law, the law, the law. And it brought on the crisis of the 1888 meetings, which put the denomination back on track and kept it a Christian denomination. That's, of course, a whole week long of lectures on 1888. Ellen White lived and worked in Australia from 1891 to 1900. That was a productive year. She didn't want to go there, by the way. That was after the 1888 meetings. The General Conference wanted her to get rid of her, get her out of their hair. They sent her to Australia. She did not want to go. And really, as you study it, she recognized once she got there how unhappy she was. This was not God's will. But God took plan B and made it plan A. Those were incredibly productive years. That's when she wrote her most Christ-centered books, Desire of Ages, Christ's Object Lesson, Steps to Christ, and her great books on education were hammered out while she was in Australia and established the work there in Australia. So God used that in spite of it not being His original will, because she believed she needed to stay in the United States and help with the situation there, but God used this time in Australia. She had a pet there. Ellen White was an animal rights activist and loved animals, and she had a pet. This was their watchdog. She named the dog Tiglath-Pileser after the evil Assyrian king. He was the ferocious watchdog. And people have asked me about the doghouse. You know, did they not fix the doghouse? This was in Australia, and the spring rains, it would flood that area, and they found that keeping the doghouse like that, it would drain itself. I don't know if Tiglath was a crooked dog, but he slept in a crooked house. But it kept it dry during the spring rains. Now, some humorous stories. Many I could tell, but let me just capitalize on a few here. This is what she wrote, and this is what is interesting. These are a few lines that have some humor behind them. But of all places, this is in Testimonies. Testimonies, Volume 1, which are what are called pointed testimonies. But in Testimonies, you find humor. This just tells you a lot about Ellen White. She was talking about how some women didn't understand Reformed dress. And she says their sisters went about their work. They should not put on clothing which would make them look like images to frighten the crows from the corn. And talking to her granddaughter some years later, she was describing the dress of some women. She said, it was so solemn. She said, don't dress as if you're going to a funeral every day. Or when the clothes of some tasteless individuals looks as if it flew and lit up on their person. So, even in simple comments, she would clothe things with a bit of humor. Now, I like this one. This is Dorsey Robinson, who was one of her workers and editors. 5 minutes? Oh, that time. Okay. I'll go to 7? No. I might go over just a little, but I'll bet you want to hear these stories. Dorsey Robinson, when he first came to work with Ellen White, she was aged. He was a young man. He was terrified of being in the presence of the prophet. And he writes about that experience. I was 20 years old and very bashful and wondered how I could live and hold converse with such a saintly woman whose conversation I expected to be entirely upon sacred things. Miss McInturfer, that was Ellen White's companion and nurse at the time, brought in a dish of greens which Mrs. White requested at nearly every meal because she thought that they were good for elderly people. Now, on the table, I'm shifting from the reading here, there was a bowl of peas, okay? So, Mrs. McInterfer set the dish of greens before Sister White with the joking remark, "Here is your horse feed, Mother." I was horrified and was looking to see Sister White rebuke her for this levity. Sister White glanced over the table, and with a humorous glint in her eye and her mouth curved up slightly, she remarked, "I don't know that my horse food is any worse than your cow peas." So, the woman used humor. But did she really laugh? Well, her grandchildren say that in the Elmshaven home, and this happened often, whenever something struck her as funny, it doesn't matter where you were in the house, whether you're upstairs, downstairs, or out in the backyard, you could hear her belly laugh. And my favorite is when she was coming back from Australia. It's my favorite story. And they stopped by the ship stopped by the island of Samoa. An Adventist community had developed there. Ellen wanted to visit them and encourage them. So she was with her daughter-in-law, May, who had an infant child with them. So they got off the boat onto a smaller boat, and they rowed to shore. And the hefty native Samoan men came out to greet them. And they saw Ellen. They'd heard about her. They were excited to see her. Two of the men, they locked their arms into a seat position. And so Ellen White sat in their arms. And they carried her on shore and put her on the beach on a rock. And she's facing the ocean, facing the boat. And so they go back out there, and one has an umbrella and motions to May to give him the baby. He'll hold the baby. And she's still in the boat now. It's rocking from the waves. And the other one turns his hot and sweaty back to her and motions for her to get on. And so she hesitates. The boat's moving. She scrambles on with her long dress, and he's slippery, and she's holding on and slipping and sliding, and the waves are splashing behind, and she's bouncing. Well, Ellen White is sitting on the rock, taking in the whole scene. And May would tell Arthur White years later, she said, and Mother White, she began to laugh and laugh and laugh uncontrollably. She laughed so hard she fell off the rock. And then when the men fearfully ran up to help her, she was laying on her back in the sand. She was still laughing. Now that is a picture of Ellen White. I endeavor to embed in the minds of my students. It's a good one to keep in mind, isn't it? Amen. That's the real Ellen White. So, other great stories. But we need to move on. Here is I have another 5 minutes? No. Here is the White family at Elmshaven. You can see her in the middle, a happy grandmother with her grandchildren, and Willie's children are grown now. You can see them. Here is she speaking at the dedicatory address at Loma Linda. This is one of only 2 photographs we have of Ellen White preaching. I was going to tell you a story here, but I don't have time. But let's just say that she knew how to project her voice, and she could speak to crowds of up to 20,000 with no microphone. In fact, in those days, camp meeting was not just for the Adventist saints. At camp meeting, all the people in the town would come, especially when Ellen White came. And that's when she spoke to a group of 20,000 people. She was a great preacher. I teach my students in preaching how to project your voice. If you speak from here, you get into trouble. There's a book of Ellen White statements about speaking from the throat. She knew how to speak from down here, as any good 19th century speaker did. But here she is. Imagine what it would be like to sit out in the audience and hear her speak. I often imagine myself sitting out there, what it would have been like. How I wish we had a tape recording of Ellen White. Wouldn't that be something? We'll have to wait till heaven. They say her voice was melodious, and it was powerful, and it rang with emphasis and intensity. Boy, I can't wait to hear her someday. Here she is with Sarah McInterfer. She, in one of the wagon trains, they would go out across the west. And on one of these, Ellen was riding a horse, and she was bucked off, and she broke her ankle, and it never healed properly, so she couldn't walk for exercise. So that's why she's somewhat heavy-set in later life. She had a good diet, but her bones were thick, and she was not able to exercise like she wanted because of that accident. But she did love to take carriage rides out in nature. like as you see here. And one day in the Washington, D.C. area, they were riding through the park, and lo and behold, they saw a huge entourage. It was the President of the United States, President Theodore Roosevelt. They went right by him, and he nodded to them. And she wrote in her diary how excited she was to see the President of the United States up close. I mean, this woman had seen angels in vision. But she was still excited to see the President of the United States. Again, part of the human side of Ellen White. Here she is at the 1909 General Conference. I'll tell you one of my favorite stories later this week that happened. It'll fit better, and actually that'll be tomorrow's presentation. There she is sitting down next to Haskell, who, after James died, proposed to Ellen. But she declined and said, I feel the Lord wants me to continue on. I can do a better work for him as single. And that's what he did. So Haskell married somebody else. As you know, she fell and broke her hip. And the last 6 months of her life, she was bedridden. That's when this picture was taken. There she is with Sarah McInturfer. This is in early 1915. She died in July of 1915. So there she is at the Elmshaven home. That's a great tour site in Adventist Heritage there in California. And here is her funeral. She died, as I said, in July of 1915. And it was a huge funeral. You can imagine, what were the people thinking then? She had been with Adventism from the beginning, and now she was gone. What would it be like without her? That had to have been a very challenging time for those believers. But we've been able to manage with the legacy of her writings. And what a blessing they have been. And by the way, you can see that. You can imagine how huge that funeral was. It was all over the country, newspapers, and of course the Adventist community. It was quite an event. Here is the burial plot at Oak Hill Cemetery. It looks different now, but that's how it looked at the time the picture was taken when she was buried next to James. And a Bible, or flowers put in the shape of a Bible with Revelation 22:12. Behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me. Isn't that appropriate for Ellen White? A.G. Daniels, our greatest conference president, my distinguished colleague, recently deceased, Ben MacArthur, has written the definitive biography of A.G. Daniels. You might check it out at the Adventist Book Center while you're here in one of the cells. But Daniels was our greatest conference president who worked with Ellen White many years. And she can best be summed up in his words. He was a high church leader. For most of his career, he worked with Ellen White. And let me conclude with his words. In this present year of our Lord, 1935, and by the way, Ellen White had been gone for quite some time now. He was on his deathbed. He was writing his famous book, The Abiding Gift of Prophecy, and he was on his deathbed as he was writing this. In this present year of our Lord, 1935, Mrs. White has been at rest 20 years. While I have been toiling on, I had had 23 years of direct observation of her life work. Since her death, I have now had 20 additional years for thoughtful reflection and study of that life and its fruits. Now, at an advanced age, with the constraint of expressing only sober, honest truth, I can say that it is my deep conviction that Mrs. White's life far transcends the life of anyone I have ever known or with whom I have ever been associated. She was uniformly pleasant, cheerful, and courageous. She was never careless, flippant, or in any way cheap in conversation or manner of life. She was the personification of serious earnestness regarding the things of the kingdom. I never once heard her boast of the gracious gift God had bestowed upon her or of the marvelous results of her endeavors. She did rejoice in the fruitage, but gave all the glory to him who wrought through her. I realize that these are grave statements, but they come from the deepest conviction and soundest judgment that I am capable of rendering. They are uttered in the sobering atmosphere of my last illness. He was dying of cancer. As I face the judge of all the earth, before whose presence I realize that I soon shall stand. And he did die not too long after this. Let me conclude with the words of Paul Harvey, famous news commentator of yesteryear, who was very well aware of Adventism and respected Ellen White, and once recommended reading Ellen White. He ended his remarks with this: Ellen White, to this large radio audience. He said, Ellen White, you don't know her? Get to know her. Get to know her. Amen? Lord, we thank you for the prophetic gift that has manifested itself in our midst. writings that we have and cherish today were written by a real live person who lived life at a different time and culture than ours, but a real life, nevertheless, like us. Bring us greater understanding and appreciation of Ellen White as a human being so that we can better understand the prophetic gift that you gave her. Bless us as we continue to study later in this week. Bless these people, all of us, as we go our separate ways this evening, as we partake of the meetings. May your Spirit be poured out once again. In Jesus' name we pray.